Archaeological Media.
When tourists visit St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City, they invariably flock to Michelangelo's Pietà, Bernini's elaborate canopy, and the magnificent dome. Few notice the simple altar in the north aisle dedicated to a man named Linus. Even fewer could tell you who he was. Yet according to ancient tradition, this obscure figure may have been the second pope, the immediate successor to Peter himself. This is White Smoke, Episode 18, The Shadowy Succession. The first century of papal history exists in a historical twilight, not completely dark, but illuminated only by fragmentary texts, conflicting accounts, and archaeological evidence that raises as many questions as it answers. This murky period challenges one of the Catholic Church's most fundamental claims, that an unbroken line of succession extends from the current pope all the way back to St. Peter, who Catholics believe was appointed by Jesus Christ himself. Today, we examine the earliest papal succession, the shadowy figures who led the Roman Church in the decades immediately following Peter's death, and whose contested legacies reveal both the fragility and resilience of the world's oldest continuously functioning institution. This is the story of how a persecuted religious minority established a leadership structure that would eventually become the papacy as we know it today. To understand the first papal succession, we must first confront the uncertain circumstances of Peter's own death. According to Catholic tradition, Peter, one of Jesus' original 12 apostles, travelled to Rome, led the Christian community there, and was crucified upside down during Emperor Nero's persecution around 64 to 67 CE. The Vatican holds that St. Peter's Basilica stands directly above his burial site. Archaeological evidence partially supports this narrative. Excavations beneath St. Peter's Basilica in the 1940s uncovered what the Vatican claims are Peter's remains, buried beneath a monument dated to approximately 160 CE. However, the archaeological record remains contested, with some scholars questioning whether the bones actually belong to Peter and whether he held a position equivalent to Pope, as we would understand it today. The historical Peter and the theological Peter are not identical, explains Dr. Rebecca Lyman, Professor Emerita of Church History at the Church Divinity School of the Pacific. The Peter of Catholic tradition, the first pope who governed the Universal Church, emerged gradually through later interpretation. The historical Peter was likely an important leader in the early Christian movement, but papal authority as we know it developed over centuries. What seems reasonably certain is that Peter was an influential figure in the early Roman Christian community, and that his martyrdom created a leadership vacuum. How that vacuum was filled remains one of the most contested questions in church history. The earliest attempt to document papal succession comes from Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon, who around 180 CE compiled a list of those who had led the Roman Church. He named Linus as Peter's immediate successor, followed by Anacletus, sometimes called Cletus, and then Clement. However, other ancient sources present different orderings, with some suggesting Clement immediately followed Peter. The Liber Pontificalis, Book of Popes, compiled centuries later, states that Linus led the Roman Church from approximately 67 to 79 CE. It describes him as an Italian from Tuscany who implemented several church practices, including prohibiting women from entering churches with uncovered heads. According to this account, Linus was martyred and buried near Peter's tomb on the Vatican Hill. Yet historical evidence for Linus remains frustratingly sparse. No contemporary documents mention him, and our knowledge comes entirely from sources written a century or more after his presumed death. Even his martyrdom, claimed in some later accounts, remains unverified by convincing historical evidence. We must acknowledge the historical limitations here, notes Dr. Michael Pepod, Professor of Theology at Fordham University. These earliest succession lists were created not primarily as historical documents, but as arguments for apostolic legitimacy against competing Christian groups. They established a connection to the apostles that validated particular teachings and authority structures. This theological motivation doesn't necessarily invalidate the lists, but it requires careful historical assessment. The actual leadership structure of the early Roman Church was likely more fluid than later accounts suggest, with multiple forms of authority operating simultaneously. To understand what leadership of the Roman Church might have meant during Linus's time, we must abandon modern conceptions of the papacy. The early Christian community in Rome was not a unified, centralized institution, but a collection of house churches, small gatherings that met in private homes for worship, instruction, and communal meals. Recent archaeological evidence suggests these house churches operated relatively independently, sometimes with distinct theological emphases and social compositions. Some may have primarily comprised Jewish Christians, others Gentile converts. Some may have emphasized charismatic gifts, others hierarchical order. The Bishop of Rome in this period was more like a coordinator among equals than a supreme pontiff, explains Dr. Carolyn Osiak, Professor Emerita of New Testament at Bright Divinity School. He would have been recognized as an important leader, particularly in mediating disputes, but not as possessing the kind of juridical authority later popes claimed. This leadership role emerged in a Rome still reeling from the Great Fire of 64 CE and Nero's subsequent persecution of Christians, which claimed both Peter and Paul according to tradition. Christians remained a tiny, vulnerable minority in a city of nearly 1 million people, constantly under suspicion as practitioners of a foreign superstition that rejected traditional Roman religious practices. Under these dangerous conditions, maintaining a low profile would have been essential. Linus likely focused on basic community organization, preserving apostolic teaching, and addressing internal disputes rather than making public pronouncements or engaging with Roman authorities. The archaeological record confirms this picture of an underground church. The earliest Christian meeting places were ordinary homes, not purpose-built structures. The catacombs, while later used for Christian burial, were not primarily hiding places for persecuted believers, as popular imagination suggests. The Roman Church under Linus was hidden in plain sight, unassuming gatherings in private dwellings throughout the city. After Linus, ancient sources indicate that leadership passed to a figure named Anacletus, sometimes called Cletus, possibly representing the same person or two different individuals. According to the Liber Pontificalis, Anacletus was a Greek from Athens who led the Roman Church from approximately 79 to 92 CE. Like Linus, Anacletus remains historically elusive. Later traditions credit him with ordaining priests and establishing commemorative monuments to Peter, but contemporary evidence for his activities is non-existent. Even his name presents difficulties, with variations appearing in different ancient lists. The confusion between Cletus and Anacletus likely stems from textual transmission issues, suggests Dr. Eamon Duffy, Professor Emeritus of Christian History at Cambridge University and author of Saints and Sinners, A History of the Popes. Names were abbreviated in manuscripts, leading to misinterpretations. Whether they were the same person or different individuals remains unresolved. This uncertainty underscores the historical challenges in reconstructing this period. We are dealing not with clearly documented succession, but with traditions recorded generations later, potentially shaped by theological concerns and manuscript corruption. What we can reasonably infer is that the Roman Christian community continued developing organizational structures during this period. Leadership roles became more defined, rituals more standardized, and connections with other Christian communities more systematic. The foundations for what would eventually become the institutional church were being laid, even if they bore little resemblance to the later papacy. With Clement, who allegedly led the Roman Church from approximately 92 to 99 CE, we encounter the first early pope who left written evidence of his leadership. Around 96 CE, Clement wrote a letter to the Christian community in Corinth, addressing an internal dispute where younger members had deposed older church leaders. This document, known as First Clement, provides our earliest glimpse into how the Roman Church understood its authority in relation to other Christian communities. Clement intervenes in Corinth's affairs with confidence, urging restoration of the deposed leaders and establishment of proper order. Clement's letter demonstrates that by the end of the 1st century, the Roman Church already claimed a special role in mediating disputes, explains Dr. Alan Brent, former professor of early Christian history and literature at Cambridge University. However, the basis of this authority was not juridical primacy, but rather Rome's status as a church founded by both Peter and Paul, its location in the imperial capital, and its reputation for doctrinal reliability. The letter emphasizes apostolic succession not as a linear chain of individual bishops, but as a collective preservation of teaching transmitted from the apostles to qualified elders. It suggests a leadership model still in transition from the charismatic authority of first-generation apostles to the institutional authority of established church offices. Clement's letter also reveals a Christian community developing sophisticated theological language and organizational concepts. It draws on both Hebrew scriptures and Greco-Roman administrative terminology, creating a distinctive Christian synthesis that would characterize later ecclesiastical development. Despite this significant written evidence, Clement himself remains somewhat mysterious. Later traditions claim he was exiled under Emperor Trajan and martyred by being tied to an anchor and thrown into the Black Sea. But these accounts appear in sources written centuries after his death. The Basilica of San Clemente in Rome, which supposedly stands above his house, actually dates from much later periods, though archaeological excavations beneath it have revealed 1st century structures. When discussing these early church leaders, we encounter a fundamental terminological problem. The ancient sources, even when describing the same individuals, don't consistently use the title Pope or even Bishop as we understand these terms today. The word Pope, from Latin papa, meaning father, was initially used for any bishop or priest and became exclusively associated with the Bishop of Rome only in later centuries. Similarly, the distinction between bishops and presbyters, elders, remained fluid in the 1st century, with the terms sometimes used interchangeably. The monarchical episcopate, the model of a single bishop governing a local church assisted by presbyters and deacons, developed gradually, notes Dr. Adam Ployd, professor of church history at Eden Theological Seminary. In Rome, this structure may not have been fully established until the middle of the 2nd century, making it anachronistic to speak of popes in the modern sense before that time. This evolving terminology reflects an evolving reality. Early church leadership adapted to changing circumstances, incorporating elements from Jewish synagogue governance, Greco-Roman household management, and the charismatic authority of apostolic witnesses. What would eventually become the papacy emerged through this complex developmental process rather than springing fully formed from Peter's appointment. Many details of these earliest popes' lives come not from contemporary sources, but from later hagiographies, stylized biographies of saints that often prioritized edification over historical accuracy. These accounts, written centuries after the events they purport to describe, filled historical gaps with standardized narratives of virtue and martyrdom. The Liber Pontificalis, compiled primarily in the 6th century with later additions, represents the most comprehensive early attempt to provide biographies for all popes. For these earliest figures, it presents suspiciously precise details, exact reign lengths, liturgical innovations, ordination numbers, and burial locations. Most historians regard these specific claims with skepticism. This retroactive history writing served important institutional purposes. By the 6th century, the papacy had emerged as a significant religious and political authority, claiming jurisdiction over the Western Church. A continuous succession narrative connecting contemporary popes directly to Peter provided essential legitimacy for these expanding claims. For the Catholic Church, this murky early period presents both challenges and opportunities. The traditional Catholic position maintains that Jesus established the papacy by appointing Peter as the first pope, and that an unbroken succession has continued from Peter through all subsequent popes. This view sees historical ambiguities as superficial problems that don't undermine the essential continuity of the institution. The Catholic understanding includes both historical facts and theological interpretation, explains Dr. Matthew Bunson, executive editor of the Catholic News Agency. The Church acknowledges historical development in how papal authority was exercised, but maintains that the essential office was established by Christ and preserved through succession despite limited historical documentation. Historical critics, by contrast, see the papacy as a gradually evolving institution that retroactively claimed apostolic foundation. They point to the lack of contemporary evidence for a monarchical episcopate in 1st century Rome and the competing leadership models evident in early Christian documents. The historical evidence suggests that monepiscopacy, rule by a single bishop, developed in Rome later than in some other Christian centres, notes Dr. Candida Moss, professor of theology at the University of Birmingham. The idea of the Pope as universal head of the Church emerged even later, through a complex process of institutional development and theoretical elaboration. These contrasting perspectives represent different approaches to history itself. The providential view emphasizes continuity beneath surface changes and interprets gaps in historical evidence through the lens of faith. Critical history emphasizes contextual development and requires explicit evidence for specific claims. Rather than simply choosing sides in this debate, we might recognize that both approaches capture important dimensions of this complex history. The papacy indeed emerged through gradual historical processes shaped by specific cultural contexts, yet it also demonstrated remarkable institutional continuity and adaptive resilience that purely secular explanations struggle to fully account for. Despite their historical obscurity, these earliest popes established precedents that would shape the institution for centuries. Their leadership during persecution demonstrated the Church's capacity to survive under hostile conditions. Their mediation in disputes established Rome's role in promoting unity among Christian communities. Their preservation of apostolic teaching created mechanisms for doctrinal continuity across generations. The shadowy succession from Peter through Linus, Anacletus, and Clement established patterns that would be elaborated by their successors. Their legacy lives on not primarily through biographical details or specific decisions, but through the institutional continuity they helped establish. A continuity that connects the modern papacy, however indirectly, to Christianity's earliest generations. White Smoke is a production of Calaroga Shark Media, portions of which were made with the help of AI narration.
There's always something brewing behind palace walls, whether it's Prince Harry and Meghan Markle making headlines from afar, or Prince William and Princess Catherine quietly preparing for the future throne. I'm Mark Francis, and on Palace Intrigue, we cover every twist, turn, whisper, and wink. From royal drama to daily gossip, follow Palace Intrigue wherever you get your podcasts.
You can call me James. I spent 23 years designing aircraft that officially don't exist for agencies you think TV made up. Until I started asking the wrong questions. Navy ships are recording objects moving at impossible speeds. Infrastructure is failing in coordinated patterns. The moon looks smaller than it did 10 years ago. None of this is a coincidence. The official explanations don't add up. This is Paranormal Aliens, where we connect the dots they don't want connected. If you're hearing this, you know where to get podcasts. Follow Paranormal Aliens. New episodes weekly until they shut me down.
Hey, my name is John Podhoretz. I'm the host of the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. We try every day to give you a sense of where America is, where the world is, where Donald Trump is, where the Democrats are, where the Republicans are, where American society is and where it's headed. Lively, significant, important topics of discussion. Please subscribe, Apple, Spotify, wherever you find podcasts, the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast.